I'm not clear whether it's a lecture as a lecture, because uh, essentially what we are talking about is something which is still in play. It's still in play for a number of reasons, uh, mainly because the Rabi harvesting season is not yet quite over, and the marketing season, of course, will continue for some time now. The background to all of this, of course, is that before COVID became news, everybody was expecting a very, very good Rabi harvest this year because of high rainfall at the end of the normal monsoon period. And that particular feature, which is that monsoon conditions were good for a record Rabi harvest in many ways, an exceptionally good Rabi harvest, has continued with minor blurbs here and there. So the background is that COVID out should have been a very, very good output in the Rabi season this year. In fact, the main Rabi crops, as you know, are gram, chana, you have rapeseed and mustard, and you have wheat, in addition to which, of course, you have the boro rice or the Rabi rice in certain parts of India. As far as gram and rapeseed and mustard are concerned, normally the harvest of those two crops is over by the beginning of April. So much of that harvest should have happened before the lockdown began. Although, of course, in the last week of the lockdown, I mean, the first week of the lockdown, which is 24th March onward, was also, the last 7 to 10 days of the gram and mustard harvesting. So there's some overlap, but not a great deal. The wheat harvest largely begins, with the exception of Madhya Pradesh, where it starts earlier, largely begins in the second week of April. And that continues, although it's again largely over by the end of the first week of May in the major northern Indian wheat producing areas. The rice harvest, of course, goes on much longer. So going by the lockdown timings, as far as output proper, that is how much is harvested, is concerned, should have affected gram and mustard much less than wheat or rice. But these are only, of course, the major crops, the major forecast crops, that is. In addition to this, of course, there's the horticulture crops, mainly vegetables, which of course come throughout this period and are perishable. Similarly, you have the livestock products, milk, meat, etc., which has also come throughout this period. And those are even more likely than grains to have been affected by the lockdown simply because of their perishable nature. Now, the effect of COVID can be broken down into a number of different aspects. The first one, I'm not going to talk too much about, the obvious one: how has COVID affected the agricultural population? How has just the simple disease impacted? What is the incidence of the disease on farm operators, whether they are farmers or they are agricultural laborers or they are people associated with transport and processing of agriculture produce? We know very little about the actual incidents, but what we do know is that this couldn't be too much of a direct effect for two reasons. Number one, whatever data we have on the impact in terms of confirmed cases of disease incidents shows it to be overwhelmingly concentrated in urban areas. And in any case, we are talking about very, very small numbers of people who are actually confirmed to have COVID compared to the population as a whole. These are minute numbers and should not affect the agricultural production directly to any significant extent. So it's not that people are sort of suddenly very ill and that's what's affecting agricultural output. It's rather the things government and to some extent society has done in order to grapple with the fear that the disease will become very large, very ugly if something is not done. And in particular, it has to do with, of course, the lockdown. Now, where does the lockdown itself affect agriculture? Lockdown affects agriculture, again, in a number of different ways. One obvious way in which it can affect, and this can be significant, and it probably is in many parts of the country, is in the movement of labor. Agricultural labor does move from one area to another. There are regions where labor is short. Their agriculture at harvest season depends a lot on labor coming in from other parts of the country. And similarly, of course, there are other regions where there is excess labor and they depend upon earnings during this harvest season on finding work, agricultural work in other parts of the country. Now, clearly, because of movement restrictions, this has been affected. And it has been affected also by the fact that a lot of people working in urban areas, as you know, have been locked up. They have not been allowed to go back home. Some people went early. They got stuck wherever they were. Some people managed to reach home. A lot of people might got stuck somewhere in between. Now, clearly, the labor force and its distribution across places did get affected much more significantly than disease itself. But again, the total numbers are probably quite small in terms of the migrant movements, especially after the lockdown period began, simply because some extent of the migration had already taken place before the 24th of March. But nonetheless, on this, we do have some information, which is that there are reports of labor shortages coming from certain parts of India. And these labor shortages are said to be quite significant in, say, parts of Andhra Pradesh, parts of Punjab, where wages have correspondingly gone up, like anything which is short. But correspondingly, of course, there have been fall in wages where people who normally go out to work were not able to go out. So one important aspect, of course, is this, which is the movement of labor. But let's also remember that, as I said, that as far as labor for gram and mustard are concerned, that harvest was already on before the lockdown came. And as far as wheat is concerned, much of it is mechanized. So the effects on these major crops is there, but it's, I think, smaller than most people would be frightened about. As far as the labor effects on the perishables, that is vegetables and livestock are concerned, I think those are, again, less important in the direct production than their distribution, to which I'm coming to. That brings me to the distribution angle, which is not so much the harvesting of the output, which was supposed to be very good, but how much farmers can realize from that harvested output. In other words, there was a crop on the ground which was a very good crop. There were certain difficulties rendered by labor movement on the ability to harvest that crop. On harvesting, we don't have very good figures as yet, but roughly we know that almost all of gram, almost all of rapeseed mustard, and about at least half, if not more, much more, of wheat production. I mean, the wheat production not yet harvested is in the eastern part of UP and Bihar. Most of this has already been harvested. And therefore, when you actually see agricultural production figures, when they ultimately come out even in GDP type figures, you would be only looking at that. That is, this was the output and that production has taken place. But there is a distance between that and what that production means to the farmer, because the farmer really gains nothing unless he's able to convert that output that he's got harvested somehow into incomes. And that is where the entire impact of COVID, and particularly the impact of the lockdown, has been working. Now, there things are a bit in the reverse as far as the sequencing is concerned, and that is in the following sense. As the lockdown went into effect, there was almost a complete stop of all forms of transport, of any resemblance of logistics, so that people were not being able to get to markets. Whatever had arrived in markets were not being able to move across to points where the retail market exists. And that was because there was total lack of clarity on what was permissible or not. Now, this situation lasted at least till the end of the first week of April, in many cases till the end of the second week of April, only after which the government was able to make clear that movement of agricultural goods was not to be interrupted. And also it sunk in that what that meant was that empty trucks should also be allowed to move. In the earlier phase, in many cases, what was happening was that empty trucks were not being allowed to move, and therefore truckers neither had the trucks in place and certainly not the incentive to actually make journeys where one travel would be relatively empty. Now, it is this logistics marketing side of, logistics and marketing side, which has actually created the main problem during the agricultural season, essentially on produce sales. But as the season wears on and as the next season comes on, the same issues will become important, and perhaps much more important, because the same issues will be affecting the supply of agricultural inputs, seeds, fertilizer, for the next crop. And that is something which we'll need to see in the future, but one can see that the problems involved are much the same and possibly more complicated, because policemen generally have the incentive to stop anything that they are told कि इसको मत रोकिए. Now, agricultural produce was there. What about pesticides? What about fertilizers? One will have to see how those things go through in the future. But so what about agricultural sales? What has happened to that? And that's where the main story lies. Now, there are certain parts which were very, very badly hit. Right at the beginning, for example, there was a rumor spread regarding the link of COVID to animals, that this is a zoonotic thing. And in particular, it was claimed that poultry can create COVID. So poultry prices fell hugely. Farmers got nothing almost for poultry. And in large parts of India, you got a situation where anyone who was planning to get an income out of poultry actually came big losses. Similarly, you got, at a lesser scale maybe, but you got a lot of the perishables, even of the fruits and vegetables kinds, being affected by the logistic problem and the mandi problems. One of the consequences of that, interestingly, as has been brought out by a very, very interesting and important paper, I think, by Vikas, is that markets which normally dealt with grains and oilseeds were now dealing more with perishable crops, simply because farmers needed to get it somewhere, and these markets were actually trying to fill in that gap and were actually concentrating on this, because after all, you have the wheat or the gram or the mustard, they can be stored at home and brought to the market later. So the markets were trying to actually do the things which have to be done first, but were not doing it particularly well. Now, the implication of this is that you get a huge fall in the total arrivals in markets for all types of goods, including uh, the perishables, although perishables fall less than the storable stuff, which are getting stored. All the output has been produced, is not getting to the market. Perishables are trying to come to the market, but the extent to which they come to the market, even though the markets are buying more of them than they usually do, is not leading to their full arrivals to the markets of the country as a whole. Now, where it shows up clearly is in the markets on the retail end. Because what I've been talking about are the markets at the producers' end. Markets at the retailers' end are actually getting half, Delhi's Azadpur market, for example, for most of the time, it has been operating with about 50% of usual arrival, and now it's probably much less than that. And yet, one of the funny things is that although there has been some increase in the prices of fruits and vegetables, it hasn't been a massive increase. What little evidence there is suggests that there has been an increase in prices of fruits and vegetables, but mainly in tier 2 and tier 3 towns, not so much in the metros, not so much in the vicinity of the larger um, retail mandis like uh, Azadpur, simply because just as supplies have become limited, less is coming in, the demand has fallen very, very sharply. The demand has fallen for a number of reasons. A big reason in the metros, obviously, is that the entire hospitality industry has more or less shut down. Restaurants, hotels, which are large buyers. But in addition, there is also the fact that if people don't have income, then hospitality aside, even their normal purchases have come down to some extent. So what we are watching really is a breakdown, whether it be in the labor market or it be in the produce markets, a breakdown of markets, which means that things are piling up at the producer's ends. They are not necessarily reaching the consumer, but the consumption demand itself has fallen off so significantly that it's not very clear whether the production and supply shortages are higher or lower at the consuming end than what the consumption decline is. So we are not very clear, I think, on how exactly the supply demand thing has worked out at the major retail ends. Because as far as the price movements are concerned, as I said, whatever evidence of a significant price increase so far is available is from relatively small towns, not in the bigger towns. Now, I think the interesting issues are going on from here. to matters such as the immediate incomes of farmers, and then on to what happens to subsequent agricultural production. Now, obviously, incomes of farmers have taken a dip. They've taken a dip very, very clearly in the case of the perishables. The poultry story, besides the poultry story on fruits and vegetables as well, the price being obtained by farmers and is relatively small, I mean, has declined. Of course, this is something which had been happening even before, and those are unstable markets, so that they keep going up and down. But one can reasonably say that farmers have been affected quite significantly by the fall in the amount that they can actually sell at a reasonable price. As far as the main forecast crops, that's wheat, gram, mustard, the government is supposed to step in with its MSP policies. The government, for example, the Punjab government claims is doing a very good job, that its procurement at the moment has been very good. Ground reports are mixed on this, because the traditional mandis where procurement happens are being forced, and I think correctly to some extent, to follow the social distancing norms. And as a result, the operations are much slower. Governments claim that they are overcoming that barrier by actually having more procurement centers, smaller procurement centers, and that they're doing a good job out of it. I think we'll still have to see what they have been actually been able to do, because frankly, I'm not very sure that whatever is being told by the government is entirely correct, or what the opposite is being told by others is not exaggerated. But whatever it is, MSP operations have become far more important for the farmer in these crops, because, as I said, the Vikas study showed, that I mentioned a little while ago, that normal mandi arrivals, normal mandi functionings were not at all, congenial to farmers getting even good prices for these non-perishable crops. And this is particularly true for things like dal and rapeseed and mustard, where although MSP operations happen, they don't usually happen to any very significant degree. And again, we really don't have the data so far to tell us how well that procurement operation has functioned so far and where. There has been procurement of grains, of dal. I'm not at all sure how much NAFED has picked up on oilseeds. Just to complete the marketing side a little bit more, on milk production, it's a story of the cooperatives, especially the bigger ones like Amul, doing quite well, quite a normal thing, although their demand has gone down quite considerably the same. But their procurement operations are good. On the other hand, the cooperatives and the large companies only buy about half to 60% of total milk production. The other 40% or so, that market, which is either serve within rural areas or people take it to urban areas to sell, has obviously come quite literally up against movement restrictions. Again, it's a question of the ability of products to move, and thereby a shortage for the consumer does not necessarily mean better incomes for the farmer, or similarly, that less available at the consumer end doesn't necessarily mean higher prices if the consumer demand itself has gone down as a result of the lockdown. So the overall picture is that the aftermath to what was supposed to have been a very good harvest has been the logistic disruption caused by the lockdown, much more than the disease itself. The disease itself has probably had hardly any impact on agriculture. It is rather the policies that have been followed, and in many ways, the initial completely knee-jerk sort of policies which have gradually over time, isko bhi allow for do, usko bhi allow for do, rather than a clear cut, a message about we have to get certain things going. Now, clearly, in the middle of all this, what certainly has happened is that the farming community, which was in any case doing pretty badly over the last 4 or 5 years, has been given another huge shock that they were not expecting. So farmers were used to unexpected shocks from weather, and they got some in Kharif this year, got another, this time out of not weather, but out of not even really COVID as a disease, but out of the way in which the government dealt with the problem of COVID without actually creating a situation in which people knew that these are the problems, these are what the government has laid out, these are the procedures we have to follow, and these are going to happen and these are not going to happen. So more than anything else, it was the disruption and the uncertainty which has cost the farming community massively. The total number on that cannot be given. But my guess at this moment would be that given the background of what was going to be a record harvest, farmers are probably getting at least 20% less than what they should have expected otherwise. The number may be more. But as I said, much more important is looking forward. And looking forward, there are a number of things which become relevant because these are yet to play themselves out and will affect what happens to the agricultural situation, both in terms of farmers' incomes as well as in terms of food availability in the future. The number one thing is that at the end of the marketing season, farmers are supposed to pay back their debts to the banking system and even to private money lenders. With reduced incomes, with possibly even more reduction in incomes because remittances aren't coming in from outside, the ability of the farming community to pay off those debts will become an issue, and we still don't have a clear-cut instruction to the banking sector or to the cooperative banking sector on what has to be followed in terms of moratorium or debt rollovers or whatever else the banking system is going to give to the farmers. And again, if the past is any guide, something will be announced when the time available for making decisions is very, very small. So this is one area which at least our financial sector, the RBI, NABARD, and others should be actually waking up to and taking the decisions on what happens to the payment of farmers' debts. Because that will have to be carried through at least during the period when any of these lockdowns are in progress and possibly beyond that. The second is the sowing for the next Kharif season. As I said, that just as output movement is affected by logistic problems because of the lockdown, so are input. And in India, a very large amount of inputs actually have to move. Our agriculture is no longer an agriculture which is self-sufficient. It's not as if you take your own seed and you plant that seed and it's gobar rather than fertilizer. It's an agriculture which may look less modern than in many other countries, but it's an agriculture where the seed often comes from thousands of kilometers away, which is dependent on chemicals of various matters. A lot of people would say should get rid of it, and this is a great opportunity. Be as it may, but that's how our agriculture works. And if these things stop moving, then it causes concern for the next harvest as well. Now, on that, again, there is time, but as I see it, apart to some extent from the Ministry of Agriculture, not much inclination so far to make this an important message going down to the guys in charge of implementing the lockouts. Unfortunately, in the country as a whole, I think what we are seeing is that whether it is the medical system or whether it is all sorts of avenues for livelihood, including agriculture, those concerns, medical or livelihood, are totally secondary to the policing of this effect. It's almost as if the idea is that we shouldn't allow these people who are infected and we don't know who is infected to move from one place to another and do everything to stop it. The disruption caused is mindless, huge, and obviously, as a result, massively expensive, with the cost falling on those dependent on those sectors for livelihood or on the services that those sectors expect. Now, in the middle of this, of course, there are people who are seeing possible green shoots, possible good things coming out of all of this. And I can name 2 or 3 of them. I've just named one. saying that, okay, maybe, the green revolution technology wasn't good, cropping pattern will change. We might have less in terms of a single crops, maybe more diversification, people trying to grow everything that they need, less dependence on chemicals. Yes, but I mean, that is something which isn't done. I mean, it can be done in two ways. It can be done because you want to do it, or it's done because you have no other option. And doing it with no other option is hardly the best way of going forward. The other part of it is, and for example, the government of Madhya Pradesh 2 days ago essentially lifted the APMC controls, saying you can sell to anyone, anywhere, and the APMC requirements no longer apply. I'm not very sure for how long this holds. In any case, I don't think it was much more than an announcement rather than a definite order to that effect, which would require legislative approval. But certainly the chief minister said it. And there are people, for example, a whole set of people who have always argued for complete banning of APMC restrictions, who see that this may be the one big positive coming out of this, which is that restrictions on sales at the market point may well be lifted. Again, it's got its positives, but it's also got its negatives. The literature on APMC is large, and so far, the real problems on the APMC side have been an inability of the state and the center to actually get to any sort of compromise. So again, something to be played out. But whatever happens, the interim will be uncertainty. And like many other things that we have this crisis and say demonetization earlier, is that it is uncertainty which hurts, because uncertainty does another thing, which is it erodes trusts. The more uncertain a situation is, relationships which have been built on trust tend to erode, and erosion of trust takes a long time to rebuild. So I think I'll end whatever I have to say there, and if you've got the questions, just put them to me.
Thank you. Thank you for this very, very interesting and wide-ranging talk. We already have quite a few questions. I'll start with those. But before, one thing that has been bothering me, maybe I should sort of raise it first, is the fact that, this entire thing was done, the imposition of the lockdown and all the very sort of drastic actions that have been taken were done without any planning and preparation. Since you've been in the planning commission for a long time, what alternatively could have been done? I mean, 2 months ago, could you have formed some high level committee to have planned this out, thought of things rather than doing it, as you said, knee jerk decisions being taken and so on? Could this have been planned?
See,
But yeah, you want to take that first, or should I also
yeah,
give you
I'll
some?
take it. You see, the
Okay.
normal thing in the 10 years I was in the planning commission would be something like this came out. The prime minister would actually have a group of ministers he would put together, and the group of ministers would take the decision. But in order to back up the group of ministers, the planning commission would usually be told, have some sort of a group of officers drawn from all the ministries concerned and outside experts, and prepare briefs for the group of ministers. And so you have an interministerial system taking advice from outside the government also to actually look into the pros and cons. Of course, the political decisions would be taken politically, but they would be informed decisions which would try to go in to the ramifications that this is a multidimensional issue. And it certainly wouldn't be that this is the one issue ye karna hai. Now that requires that the responsibility is shared. It also requires, it also involves, that takes a little bit more time. And it certainly doesn't have the blinding this thing of कि भाई कल से ये होने वाला है. Unfortunately, in the present government, one gets the impression, I may be wrong, one gets the impression that a decision is first made and then the ways of implementing are sought after that decision is made. That's not the way governments ought to work, not the way that the government worked in those days.
There are actually a lot of questions. I've tried to sort of put them into some structure. Okay, there are some questions on, the long-term implications. Depletion of private savings by rural households during the lockdown may have long-term effect on the capital expenditure in agriculture. What do you think? So, what will be the effect on long-term capital formation in agriculture? The other is about debt relief. Even if there is a debt, loan waiver or a moratorium, it will only affect the formal sector credit. What about the private money lenders? Is there something that one could do for them? How does one deal with that? You want to take those?
See, these are problems which, as we all know, the country has been grappling for some time now. I mean, we had the demand for debt waivers, the fact that farmers' incomes were very low. All of this played out 2 years ago during the then into the elections last year. These issues, I would say, are continuing issues, and they've simply become that much larger with the losses which are being imposed by the present conditions. But the nature of the problem hasn't really changed. What one wants to see is whether or not the willingness of governments to grapple with the problem in a more realistic manner has changed. So far, the only big difference is, of course, the PM Kisan, which didn't exist 2 years ago. A certain amount of money is being given, but that's not a substitute for a clear-cut policy on debt or on how the government sees all of these things, incomes and credit, for agricultural investment. In my own feeling, investment is probably a second order of importance than the functioning of the farmer sector. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There are some questions about, the distress. There is a whole history of farmer suicides in the past, even when such a pandemic was not there. What do you think could COVID pandemic do to something of that kind? I mean, do you think something like that could exacerbate during this period, what. Then there is also a question about, what would be the impact on marginal farmers, on sharecroppers, and the poorer sections of the peasantry.
See, clearly, I mean, clearly as far as which section is affected, clearly all sections of the farming community will be affected. Some because they don't have employment, others because they're unable to sell. So, yes, normally there are differences. And differences will continue between different groups within the farming community. But I think that's less important than the fact that the farming community needs to be looked at as a whole. And I think the only thing to be said there is the PM Kisan, for example, simply ignores the landless, whether a tenant or a landless laborer. So the government's response has been selective in keeping a whole marginal group out of that uh, initiative of theirs. As far as suicides are concerned, I really don't know. Because uh, in a sense, whatever went into suicides, which is that you're not being able to pay debt, all of that continues. But in one respect, this period is slightly different, which is that it will be seen as something where there is something which is affecting the community rather than the individual. Now, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't really say whether that would make any difference. But I think, again, those are things which have happened. And I think it's less important to look at those things through the COVID angle as to simply say that COVID adds to all the uncertainties, all of the difficulties facing farmers, which led to suicides in the first place.
There are some questions about, there are in fact three or four questions about the whole reverse migration that has taken place. What would be the implications on labor supply in urban areas? What would be the impact on employment and incomes in rural areas? Would they come back? Would there be fear of coming back to cities? Would farming become more attractive? What would be the implications on all of this, on the potential migration in future?
See, clearly one thing we can say, something similar, although to a lesser extent, happened during demonetization as well. But after demonetization, people got back, they came back because industries and shops which are shut down because of demonetization reopened pretty quickly. And after demonetization was over, and there was no fear regarding that coming back. Here, there is a fear. And how that's going to play itself over, we don't know, but it's safe to assume that the process will drag a lot more than that previous situation. Now, if that does happen, then the costs are there, of course, to the laborer who will have to somehow find work wherever they are, and also to the employer, because many employers in the urban areas will simply either not be able to operate on the full scale without the labor, or would have to operate on a substandard quality. So it's an efficiency loss for the economy in a significant manner, for an economy which has so many people in the labor force who are migrants. And just going back to the villages and finding things there is obviously not optimal, because if it were, it wouldn't have, the migration wouldn't have happened in the first place. Nonetheless, yes, like everything else which COVID is doing, which is leading towards, uh, you know, trying to become more closed and operate in smaller economies, that may well happen. But I don't think we should either be uh, very hopeful about it, or certainly we shouldn't think that that might be a good thing happening. Uh, but as I said, the real point is that the fear of what might happen if you start moving again, that's the one big unknown, and is the big difference between now and, say, demonetization, which will play itself through. Uh, and yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the government is doing. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I think one of the things is. Bolo.
Yours.
No, go ahead. There are two questions.
Yeah, the two questions about on inflation. One about the Indian context. What do you think? Would there be high inflation, and what will be its impact on the economy? The other is in the global context. The comparing it to the food crisis of 2008, when oil and food prices shot up. Now we have a sharp fall in the oil prices, and direction of food prices is not clear. Global supply chains have broken down like they did in 2008. What do you anticipate would happen globally in the food economy?
See, globally, we've got the data for the first 3 months till the beginning of April, really. And what it shows is that both food and non-food agriculture prices, which were shooting up in the second half of 2019, have started coming down very sharply in the next 3 months. And that is probably the way it is headed. And as you say, the usual correlation between oil prices and agricultural prices would tend to support that that's the direction it will take. But and given that there's a dislocation in supply chains, it would obviously mean that some things could go up somewhere. But overall, the breakdown would be reflecting the fact that the big story of the world economy is that world GDP is almost certainly likely to fall. And their demand is likely to fall. And therefore, you are going to have lower demand for everything, including food. And most governments will be protective of their agriculture. So anyone trying to be in the export markets is going to get a bigger hit than anyone else. As far as the domestic story is concerned, the story in the short run is, as far as wheat and rice are concerned, our stocks are pretty high, no real danger of inflation there. For the other crops, again, there are certain crops where, if anything, We are watching an excess of supplies. Sugar is one, even milk is another. Because the milk is coming in, and the demand has sort of flopped through because there's a lot of the demand which is in the restaurant and other sweet making and all that. Uh, so sugar, now where could prices go up in the short run? As I said, for some vegetables, this did happen mainly in the smaller towns, mainly because of logistic reasons. Things were not simply getting there. That can happen, but that's nothing to do with the agriculture side of it. It has to do with getting the logistics right. The agricultural impact, if any, going forward would be through its effect on agricultural output and growth in subsequent seasons and subsequent years. It may happen, but my own reading is that probably that's not something we should be too worried about, because if we can do something even reasonable about the other things, which is the debt and about the logistics, then agriculture has a remarkable ability to you know get back onto its feet pretty quickly. And so I wouldn't sort of start saying that 3 साल बाद ये होगा and things. I'm not going to get into that sort of discussion.
There is one question about specifically about Punjab. In fact, it's something that came to my notice as well, which was this message going around that how Punjab's doing very well in terms of procurement, and the producers, I mean, the procurement's going very well, and how this has happened despite the fact that there is an opposition party in power in Punjab, and while there are several other states where that has not happened, and in some sense putting the blame on those opposition parties in power there for not cooperating with the central government. What's your sense of how things have gone on in Punjab, and what is behind it, if at all there is a lot of
Yeah, I really don't know. But normally what happens in Punjab is that the FCI plays very little role itself. The entire procurement operation is done by the Punjab agencies itself. The role that the central government plays is to at least ensure that banks keep the money coming. So long as that is happening, the Punjab government does it. So the fact there is an opposition and opposition government in Punjab won't stop that opposition government from doing whatever it wants to do, unless the money for the thing is stopped. Okay, so but what's happening on the ground, as I said, there are conflicting reports.
Okay, now I think the last set of questions are basically about what's your policy recommendation? What do you think needs to be done for agriculture?
See, I think more than agriculture, I think the nature of the present problem is one which, while if you're interested in agriculture, that's what you look at. I think far more important is to actually look at it in terms not so much of agriculture, but of rural people and of rural occupations, and the role of agriculture within that in terms of an activity which is important in terms of producing food and food security. Now, while food security concerns should weigh with the central government, I think those concerns at the moment are not such that it should be our number one concern. We'll have at the end of this episode many other concerns which will be frightening. For example, what happens to the entire MSME? There will be a huge problems with the banking sector. The agriculture's role as simply producing the food will be a concern, is a very important concern, but that's not the concern which will be the stuff that the present crisis brings it to number one place. What will be more interesting to watch is how this affects the fact, and as you said for a few questions earlier, whether people will be willing to go back as migrants again. Are you likely to have a situation where people want to stay where they are? Now, so far, the COVID incidence, as I said right at the beginning of my talk, has been, at least the measured one, has been far less in rural areas than in urban. And there's a reason for that, lower density of population. But there's another reason for that, hardly any testing. Now, if it is the case that 6 months on from now, you know that density matters more than anything else. People have moved and are unwilling to go back. And the relaxation of the lockdown as it is happening with the green zones, all mainly rural, and rural activities even being allowed in red zones, you might well have significant parts of the industrial and services sectors relocating from now urban areas to rural areas. Now, if that happens, then that's a positive.
Yeah, that's really speculating, no?
It's speculating, but that's the incentive structure which is being set up.
Yeah. Or would it be that there is, in fact, so much surplus labor that even if some people are reluctant to come to the cities, there are many more who would still want to come because of the opportunities available in the cities. The cities would
No, of
still
course, that's
attract
true.
labor.
Of course, it's true. I mean, as the memory of what we've just been through fades, people will say कि फिर भी क्या वहां तो पैसे मिलता है तो कुछ भी नहीं मिलता है.
That's true.
Now, but how long will those memories take to fade? And second, whether in between then and now, you do have some urban guys deciding कि भाई जहाँ पे at the moment you've got a brick kiln, उसके साथ साथ हम अपना छोटा सा कारखाना लगा देते हैं, rather than making it here. At least labor is available here. There is no lockdown here. God knows. I mean, the point is, it's a big enough shock, and motivated by the fact that people don't want to move, that something else will move. But it won't obviously overpower the first round effect. It's just simply a second round effect. So it will still be the case that there will be too many people there.
There are a couple of new questions about, if you want to take, on the relationship of Indian agriculture with the global economy. How would, for example, changes in rules related to FDI impact on agriculture? What happens to the export potential of Indian agriculture, and so on, post-COVID?
See, difficult to say. This is a big international development. On this again will be the one we are seeing. I don't know how it's going to play out. Is the China-US tag. Now, China is a very large importer of agricultural products. Whether or not India is likely to try and use fill that market, whether it in fact has any ability to do so also has to be seen. And of course, there are on the US side, there'll be search for new markets and there'll be pressurizing countries to open up. There again, India will feel the, for example, on poultry, you might actually get, you never know with Indians, कि जी हमारा चिकन में तो कोविड है उनके चिकन में शायद ठीक है पता नहीं क्या. So you can market these things any way or the other, but yes, there will be a disruption in global trade. The China US pact will be pretty central to it. On the one hand, it does mean the potential for markets in China, which we may or may not be able to utilize. On the other hand, there will be the US attempts to pry open markets again, which we may be victims of.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. Thank you for taking the questions. And thank you everyone for joining in. Before we close, let me tell all our audience that our second week schedule is out. And we are going to have 6 lectures next week. All the lectures are going to be at 5:30 as usual. So please remember, please mark it on your calendars and please join. Thank you very much for joining today. Have a nice weekend.